Okay, so I have the preeminent Ukrainian historian with me today, and I was just at Harvard delivering a talk at the Ukrainian Institute. So the one and only historian, Dr. Serhii Plokhii, how you doing?
Well, I'm doing very well, and yeah, I want to start with thanking you for accepting invitation to come to Harvard. So that was highlight of our spring semester series. So we really enjoyed you having over at the institute at Harvard, and we look forward to visits in the future.
Listen, who would turn down a trip to Harvard? You know, it was my first time on campus.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't recall. Yeah.
For the first
Yeah.
time, you did exceptionally well. Yes.
Coming from you, I appreciate that. I'm actually in DeLand, Florida, which is about an hour outside of Orlando, and I'm finishing up my college tour talk. So I'm going to be speaking at Stetson University for the past couple of days, and then from there I'm going to Duke, and I'm going to University of North Carolina. Though Duke and North Carolina, they have 2 or 3 days of events where they're welcoming Ukrainian scholars and professionals from Ukraine, for panel discussions, etc. So, yeah, so it's pretty interesting that I feel like in the United States, Ukraine, rightfully so, is being featured and being centered at all these centers where it was almost always dominated by Russia. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah. Well, and again, thanks for doing that. Generally, of course, people have to pay much more attention, I think, that they have been paying so far to what is happening in Ukraine and around Ukraine. But also the perspective that you are offering is quite unique. So I can tell you certainly that was quite unique from the perspective of the events that we normally have at Harvard and at our institute. So please keep doing that to a degree that you can. It's really appreciated by a lot of people.
Oh, I appreciate it. I'm actually going to be continuing my talks into the fall. So I have about at least 10 lined up, and then I'll be doing this into 2025. So I'm definitely keep continuing to do it. And I plan on going back to Ukraine this summer. And so I will spend the next half of my time over there. So I'm definitely not slowing down. But before I get into all this, the talks today about Ukrainian history and how the teaching of Ukrainian history has changed since the second Russian invasion, I want to ask you how you're doing. And anytime I ask my guests this, they're kind of surprised by it because we deal with all this heavy stuff. And, I like to think of my guests as people, right? Because you are. And I visited your hometown, Zaporizhia, which has been the target of Russian strikes. And I know you clearly have family there. So I just want to ask you how you're doing and coping with all this tragic news that you have to, teach, but also as a person you got to deal with.
Yes, I'm certainly, for a Ukrainian, I'm in a very privileged position. So I'm not going to bed every night thinking whether I would wake up or not, as many people in Ukraine do. We are having this conversation. It's March 25th, Monday, right? So I woke up to the normal morning. You check the news, what happened in Ukraine. So there was attack on the art academy in Kiev. So the main building of the academy on Pechersk, out of all places, is destroyed. And the day before that, I woke up to the news that my native city of Zaporizhia was bombed. It was a few days ago. So again, the first reaction, you check the news, you call your relatives, in this case, my sister. So that's the almost daily routine now. And again, I say that I'm in safety, and I only can imagine what people go through who really under bombardment or threat of bombardment by missiles 24/7.
Yeah, I get you, because the last time I was in Ukraine, it was in November, and I know what it's like when the war initially started, when you wake up to these attacks, and then I also know what it feels like when, going 2 years later into the invasion, and neither time or period of the Russian attacks feel any less terrifying. And is at the point where where outgoing, versus incoming, and those Serhii drones, people recognize them because they're so loud.
Right, right.
You literally know. And when I was in Odessa, I actually saw a drone from my window hit a neighborhood. So it's, you see this stuff on TV, but to actually see it in real life is truly terrifying. And so each day I wake up, I have the alarms on my phone that tell me where Ukraine is being targeted. And then I also just do a check-in with my friends.
Right.
About, right. Hey, how you doing? Yeah. Because, I'm lucky, man. Like, I'm lucky. We're lucky, too, because of we're here in the United States. But then also, I'm lucky that no one that I know, at least closely, has been injured or killed,
Yeah. Unfortunately, I can't say that. Quite a few people whom I knew personally are not with us anymore, including my cousin, and a person whose name becomes more and more known now. It's Victoria Amelina, Ukrainian writer and poet, and who spent, before the start of this big stage of the war, the current stage of the war, she spent 1 year here in Boston area and was part of our community to a degree that there were cultural events and other events. She attended them. And she wrote a poem that I think just reflects the state of the society in Ukraine, about air alert and about the missile attack. And she compared that to being in cell in prison, where there is a lot of people and there is a knock on the door. And like back in the 1930s during the Great Terror, the prison guards are coming in and calling someone, and this is for execution. And everyone is awaiting that knock on the door and this call. And then someone else is taken taken out of the cell, and so what she described were emotions, and the final phrase was, "Okay, this time it's not me, but next time it can be me." And that's this comparison to the being in the prison and the fact on the death row, and not knowing whether this knock for you or for somebody else. That's for me was very powerful metaphor for what Ukrainian society goes through day in, day out, now going into the third year of the big war.
Yeah, man, that's definitely. I never met Victoria, but many of my friends actually knew her, and they have similar stories about her. And I'm sad that I never had an opportunity to meet her, and I'm angry that the Russians did this to her, which I think speaks to even, more of the urgency to give Ukraine exactly what it needs, so that fewer of these great people aren't taken for us, And I want to talk to you about your work as a historian, as a preeminent historian here in the world of Ukrainian history. And as somebody who has a master's degree in Russian, East European, Eurasian studies. I graduated from one of the many centers that grants these degrees. And we always know that it starts with Russian, right? I got my degree in 2009. However, was somebody who focused on Ukraine since that time, right? But I feel like now, because of this second invasion, the big war, more people are focusing on Ukraine because they have to. And I'm really interested in your experience of how this war has impacted the way that you're teaching history at Harvard now.
Thank you. Well, one thing that really pretty much existed before 2022 and especially before 2014, that's where the annexation of the Crimea happened and the war really started. So the situation back then, before 2014 and to a great degree before 2022, was that I and people with whom I worked at the Institute, we had monopoly on Ukraine. Right, so other people were not interested for this reason or for that. So originally it was a shock when on Harvard campus there was a protest against the Russian musicians who who supported the annexation of the Crimea. And it turned out that I didn't know any person in that protest. Those were not usual suspects. Those were people from either the musical community or people associated with Russian studies or emigres from Ukraine, from the former Soviet republics. Probably minority of them would be Ukrainian, there would be Jews, and there would be Russians and others. So that was a shock and wake-up call when probably not only for us, but also for the administration of Harvard, when they called us and said, okay, guys, explain what is going on, and we didn't know. And we then worked with that group. We found a way how to really do this protest and channel protest in the most productive way. But that was the beginning. And this semester, I'm teaching a course on Russia and Ukraine. And in the government department, there is a course on the war in Ukraine. And the previous semester in Kennedy School, there was a course on Ukraine as well. So you just try to figure out what is happening around the campus, and I'm not even mentioning the talk. So we found ourselves to be in the center of attention, not being really fully prepared, because we lived for not just years, but for decades, studying an issue subject that broader community, academic community, and public at large were not particularly interested. And it's on the one hand, great position to be, because I believe we have a sort of a knowledge and understanding that people who arrived into the field yesterday or before yesterday don't. But it's also that you have to think about different formats, a different language, and different arguments as well. So it is. I wish that this awakening of interest in Ukraine happened under different circumstances and for different reasons. But we are where we are, and we are trying to do whatever we can to really make the Harvard motto that Harvard produces good knowledge really as meaningful as it can be. So we are there in the business of producing good knowledge.
I hope that Harvard, of all places, could produce good knowledge,
Yes.
Yeah. So one of the things that this invasion, the second invasion, has created are opportunities for Ukraine to showcase itself in its history, and it's introducing a lot of people to a country of, at least pre-war, roughly 45 million people. And and there's a large conversation about Ukrainian identity and history that's going on, particularly online. And Putin is obsessed with, his version of Ukrainian history. For example, back in 2001, he wrote, I don't know if he wrote it or not, but he published under his name this ahistorical essay about Ukraine and Russia's relationship with the country and Kiev and the Rus and all this other stuff that was full of lies. But, why do you think that Putin is so obsessed with creating this pseudo version of Ukrainian history and is trying to convince the world that his version is right?
There is a number of reasons for this war. On the one hand, it looks completely senseless. And especially given that we're in the 21st century when governments in general, their concern is not territory anymore. Their concern is and they deal that in different way, sometimes in a very bad way, but it's about the population and the economic development and at least keeping electorate happy or reasonably happy. That's the norm for democracies, but not only democracies. And here we see this the first annexation of a territory of another state in Europe since 1945. We see the largest war in Europe since 1945. And the questions are why. And I understand that a person whom your viewers, your listeners certainly know quite well, it's Tucker Carlson. You know that he went to Moscow a month ago or something like that. And his question was about why the war. And I'm sure that the expectation was that there would be narratives about American imperialism and NATO expansion and so on and so forth. But Putin treated Tucker Carlson and his viewers and listeners to 30 minutes of lecture on history, which points you how important, right, how important that what you mentioned, the history and identity issues are for him and how central they are for this war. So what I can tell you, certainly reading the essay that you mentioned, listening to this another quote unquote lecture, is that it's not particularly original. That it comes, 99.9% of it comes from the school textbooks of the Russian Empire of the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century. So in terms of understanding of history, it is as imperialist project as it is in terms of its execution and the war on Ukraine. And part of the imperial understanding of history of Russia and history of Ukraine was that Ukraine doesn't exist, that it is part of a big Russian nation. So that is something that students in high schools were reading in the Russian Empire at the turn of the 20th century. And that's the vision that was sent into exile, sent to the dustbin of history by the events of revolution of 1917. And the world was reimagined, and now Putin is trying to bring back really the world of the 19th century in terms of vision of history, vision of identity. What he gets in return is, of course, Ukrainian resistance. And that Ukrainian resistance is, to a great degree, about history and complete disagreement with his interpretation of history and identity. Ukrainians are saying every single day, with every casualty, with every surviving person, we are Ukrainians. We want to be in our own country and decide our issues on our own. We are a nation. And that's something that Putin tries to undo, bring the world back to the 19th century thinking and 19th century rules of behavior in the world.
Anytime people think about the quote unquote good old days, it tells me that they're not happy with what they see moving forward. They're not happy with progress. And Trump has the same mentality. He talks about the good old days. And so, particularly as a Black person in the United States, the good old days means Jim Crow. It means very racist redlining, where my people after World War II were not able to live in certain places and buy homes. It also meant that people like my grandmother, who actually moved from the South up to the North, they were put in under-resourced communities that led to urban crime and poverty. It means police abuse. It means displacement. That's what the good old days mean for me when Donald Trump talks about it. And I can only imagine what the quote unquote good old days or the great empire days for you as a Ukrainian. It means Russian occupation. It means Soviet oppression. It means a complete annihilation of Ukrainian culture. I feel like that's something that our communities have parallel understandings of when we're going back to the past, because for us, progress means a diverse and multicultural society. It means one, quite frankly, just by the demographics, it means the browning of America. They're just in the next 50 years, this country is in America, United States, is going to be majority people of color. And that's inevitable. That's going to happen, right? And that's something that Donald Trump and his MAGA contingency fears. And in Ukraine, that means an eventual move into the European Union. That means NATO. That means its own it means its own sovereignty, which is the antithesis of what Putin wants, which is why I think that he and Donald Trump get along so well. Putin is an autocrat. Well, I think he's slipping into totalitarianism pretty much. Now he's gone from autocracy. I think he's straight autocrat. And then Trump wants to be an autocrat, but he can't because the institutions, our legal institutions, are too strong and they won't let him.
Yes, absolutely. I agree that there is a sort of affinity that is there between a number of leaders in the world that came to the fore after the Great Recession. For me as a historian, this is very closely resembles the history of the world after the Great Depression in the 1930s, with the rise of fascism and Nazism. And the really rise of xenophobia and rise of populism and rise of either dictators or strongmen. Unfortunately, we didn't learn lessons from the 1930s. And we as human beings, it looks like if we don't learn lessons, we behave in the same way. There is an economic distress, and there is unhappiness, and there is a concern about the future, and you see strongmen appearing out there and offering order and offering vision that is not vision of the future, but vision of the past. So what is different between 1930s and today? There are a lot of differences, but one difference that comes to my mind, first of all, is that back in the 1930s, the United States was, for reasons of geography and difficulty with communication, and you name it, different history, was outside of that general trend that emerged in Europe and engulfed Europe. But there is globalization is here. So this time around, the United States are not immune. So United States are marching to the same drum as many countries of Europe and in other parts of the world as well. So this threat to the U.S. of this new populism and the rise of strongman and tendencies that are associated with that, this threat to the United States is much more serious to a degree than it was in the 1930s. The Atlantic Ocean doesn't count for as much as it counted back in 1933 or 1939. And threat to the US means also a threat to the world as a whole. So I don't want to over-dramatize, but there are certain parallels with the 1930s and certain changes that happened since the 1930s that are not in favor of democracy, minorities, and really progress, the way how you described it.
Yeah, I hear that. You know, you mentioned something earlier when you were talking about 1917 and the revolution, but as somebody who studies Ukraine, I know that of the countries that was the countries that the Soviets colonized, right? That didn't happen straight away, and there were a lot of resistance movements leading, you know, after 1917 that occurred. And I know that Ukraine in particular was a country that the Soviets had a really hard time reigning in those early years. So do you mind taking us through that? Because I think this speaks to the history of Ukrainian resistance that a lot of people don't know about.
Yes, certainly the Russia today and the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire before that has been either empires or beneficiaries of the imperial conquest. The Soviet Union controlled 1/6 of the earth. Well, you don't get in control of 1/6 of the earth unless you are an empire, right? And that's just one of the first things to keep in mind, just to map the territory. And when Russia now tries to present itself to India, to Africa, to Latin America as a fighter against imperialism, my advice is, guys, look at the map, and you will get the idea what sort of a leader you are getting in fight against imperialism. And you're absolutely right that, like in any empire, the population that is conquered, included, oppressed, it is not happy. And in Ukraine, you had the largest popular and peasant uprisings and revolts during the Russian Revolution of 1917, larger than anywhere in that part of the empire. The largest peasant army, led by the anarchist Nestor Makhno, comes from Ukraine, from southern Ukraine, from the area where the main battle fields of the last year and a half of the Russo-Ukrainian war is happening. Southern Ukraine, the city of Gulay-Pole. And then you move to the Second World War, when Russia, or Soviet Union rather, at that time, it takes over parts of Eastern Europe, Baltic states, Western Ukraine, and then loses it to Germany, with part of this anti-Soviet movement siding with Germany, seeing their ally. So to the same degree as parts of Indians were siding with Japan, or what was happening in Philippines or Indonesia. So the awful either German and Nazi regime or Japanese regime, which turned out to be much more colonial than the previous one, but originally was viewed as a liberator from earlier imperialism and colonialism. So in most cases, those people very early learn that they made a mistake. And in case of the Ukrainian nationalist movement, that was led, at least the biggest chunk of it, was led by the person whose name was Stepan Bandera. He learned that pretty fast already in summer of 1941, when he was arrested by the Germans and ordered to recall the declaration of Ukrainian independence. He refused, was sent to the German concentration camp called Sachsenhausen, where he spent most of World War II having an opportunity to think hard about the future of Ukraine and mistakes that he and his movement made. So to a degree that in 1944, 1945, when Germans were offered him a release from imprisonment in return for calling on the Ukrainian nationalist resistance to join the Germans, he escaped eventually. So it's a very, very complex and very, in parts heroic and in parts very, very tragic part of Ukrainian story. But the bottom line is that the resistance against the Soviet regime was going into the early 1950s. So imagine the picture, May 1945. The red banner is over Reichstag in Berlin. The Soviet Union controls, if not half of the world, then half of Europe. The half of the world would be there with the Chinese Revolution of 1949. And within the Soviet Union itself, there are guerrilla units continuing fighting war up until Stalin's death in 1953. So that's the story of the Ukrainian resistance, first during the Revolution of 1917 and then in the aftermath of the Second World War.
We hear a lot about Stepan Bandera, and I feel like we don't, I feel like there is a contingency of people, particularly online, who use him as a way to say that, well, hey, this is the man who was the father of Ukrainian Nazism, so to speak, right? And then it's something that Putin talks about. When I watch interviews of Russians who are in Ukrainian captivity, they all say we came here to fight Stepan Bandera. And tell us what we get right and what we get wrong about him.
Yeah. Well, one thing is that Bandera was the leader of one of the groups of the Ukrainian nationalists in terms of Ukrainian nationalism, and the father of Ukrainian radical nationalism. His name was Dmitro Dontsov, and we at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute just published his biography, intellectual biography. A wonderful, wonderful book, very, very well researched and written. Trevor Erlacher is the author. So I highly recommend it. But Bandera himself, he spent most of the 1930s on the death row in the Polish prison for the assassination of the Polish Minister of Interior that he helped to organize. Then he was, World War I started, he was released and then imprisoned now by the Nazis in the summer of 1941. And then escaped from Berlin in 1945 in the he was under house arrest at that time, last months of World War II, and spent the rest of his life in West Germany. So if he was really a father of Ukrainian fascism, Nazism, you call it, that was father who was never home. And which means we are dealing here with mythology. And Bandera had very limited relation really to the anti-communist struggle after World War II. There were other people who were conducting the struggle. He was in Germany. That was time, I want to remind you, before email, before WhatsApp and other things. So it was very difficult to be present in more than one place. And the place that he was present was Munich, Germany, was not Lviv or Kyiv, Ukraine. But why there is so much focus on Bandera because he gave the name to the group of the fighters that were in Ukraine at that time. And the entire Soviet propaganda since 1944 all the way into the early 1950s tried to actually discredit the Ukrainian resistance movement as Banderites by diminishing them, by calling by the name of the figure, not by their ideology. And eventually in 1959, and I have a book about that called The Man with the Poison Gun, Bandera was assassinated by the KGB. And that new weapon made it into Ian Fleming's last book on Bond, or one of the last books. Probably it wasn't last. Most people didn't read the book, but now it for the film, The Man with the Golden Gun. So some themes were ended up there. So we are dealing, on the one hand, with the very real Ukrainian nationalist resistance. On the other hand, with a figure who became a symbolic figure and didn't have much of relation to that movement, especially after 1945. He was part of it, but he was an immigration. And then a highly developed Soviet-era mythology that was used in 2014 and then 2022 to try to mobilize the Russian public in general and justify the war against Ukraine. Because there is an inbuilt and very clear, not just tension, but conflict between the ideology of this war, where Putin says Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same people, and we are waging the war to liberate them from awful Nazis led by Volodymyr Zelensky, who happened to be the only Jewish president outside of Israel. So there are issues there, but then with the sort of the war that is being fought, with the cities being leveled out, how you can explain to the Russians this war and these atrocities against someone who allegedly are Russians? You can explain by dehumanizing them and by calling them different names, and you call them Banderites. And it doesn't mean whether you are nationalist or not, whether you are liberal or not, whether you're Ukrainian, Russian, or a Jew, or a Crimean Tatar, the term Banderite would apply. But because there were so many years spent in the Soviet Union really trying to delegitimize any Ukrainian attempt for independence by linking it to one particular person, and not just person, but the particular image of that person that propaganda had created.
Definitely. I definitely get that. And so what do you say to people, for example, who talked about how he was definitely somebody who supported Nazi Germany, but was all in pursuit of an independent Ukraine, which you explained, which we know that Hitler didn't want. And we, as you said, that he was eventually arrested. So he's also accused of organizing massacres of Poles and Jews through the order of the Ukrainian nationalists. And there is a professor whose name is Gulnaz Sarafudinova at King's College in London, who brings it up. So what's your response to that in particular?
Well, my response is that the actions of the situation with the ethnic cleansing, and this is Ukrainian-Polish project. It's the Ukrainian-Polish it's war really that happened in 1943, 1944, with a lot of ethnic cleansing, with a lot of civilian casualties. And roughly the estimates are, I didn't do my own original research, but looking at the literature, the estimates are that probably 3 times as many Poles died as did Ukrainians. So on the Ukrainian side, it was the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists that was pretty much responsible for that. The debates about whether there were orders at the top or not, again, they're still going on. Who started first and who should be blamed, that is being discussed as well. But what we know, roughly estimates of the victims, and that gives you the perspective. Now, did that happen? That happened. Were there the participation of Ukrainian nationalists in the Jewish pogroms, for example? Yes, there were. But was there the organization itself, whether it was given any particular orders? We don't have evidence about that. The participation of the local police recruited by Germans in the Holocaust is well documented. But whether they were members of the Bandera unit, no, if they were actually minority. A lot of people were actually members of the Communist Party and the Communist Youth League because they were trying to protect themselves by joining the police formations. So it's a tragic story with a lot of people and ideologies to blame. But one thing that is really undermines any credibility of the articles that you just cited is that Stepan Bandera at that time was in German prison. And unless you imagine that there was Wi-Fi, you have a problem with that sort of argumentation. So what we see is, instead of really looking at the complexities of the story, really learning lessons about that and trying to deal with that, the propaganda never does that. The propaganda looks for labels, the propaganda looks for individuals, and then if the facts don't really work, well, the worse is to the facts, not to the so it's again.
Facts are messy, Sergei. Right, Serhii. Facts are, It's because what you're talking about, like what happens in a lot of these tragic events, it's messy. There's so many players, there's so many people that are involved. There are a lot of things that we can never fully verify. And so when you can't verify a lot of these things, right, the propaganda comes in and it takes reign, and it's easy to listen to the propaganda because it taps into our emotions and our feelings, as opposed to it making us do the really necessary work to reflect and take the lessons from these very painful moments. That's something that's really true. But you're definitely right. I don't think there was Wi-Fi in the early to mid 1940s, by the way.
Yeah. And regarding propaganda, it's easy to remember one name, which also doesn't sound more like I don't know, Spanish than Ukrainian or Slavic, Bandera. And then remembering 2 or 3 or 4 names and understanding what was really going on. Yes.
Yeah, I want to get into, a lot of this conversation about the quote unquote ethnic Russian being threatened in Ukraine, which that's a common a common untruth that I hear with people. But I don't think a lot of people realized how colonized, the colonization process of Ukraine, because it was pale as settlement under Catherine the Great. There were a lot of forced migrations of Russians into Ukrainian territory during the Russian Empire before it became the Soviet Union. And so, do you mind breaking down the history of how, of how this narrative of how really Russians got into Ukrainian lands, and how that's being set up to accuse Ukrainians of falsely accusing Ukrainians of this anti-Russian sentiment?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. The story of Russian-Ukrainian relations is a very long one. Russia takes control over parts of Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, with Kiev, in the 17th century. And that's quite late in the Russian imperial history. So my colleague Tim Snyder at Yale, he noticed that the Russians got to the Pacific Ocean before they got to Kiev next door. And then the rest of Ukraine would be integrated into the Russian Empire only at the end of the 18th century. And the final parts, including Western Ukraine and Transcarpathia, would not be integrated until the year 1945.
They're Austro-Hungarian, right?
Yeah, so we see a process between mid-17th century and mid-20th century, 300 years of steadily taken over by Russia Ukrainian territory. So it's not a one event. And it's natural that areas that were more under the Russian control have more Russian population and are more Russified in cultural terms, because the education before the 1917 was open only in Russian. The publications in Ukrainian language were prohibited for more than 40 years in the second half of the 17th century, going in the 20th century. So a lot of Russification was taking place. So imagine you are a talented young student, as I'm sure you were, who wants to really get university education to see the world, maybe to make a career in journalism or otherwise. Well, guess what? You would have to learn how to write and read. And that would not be in your language, that would be in Russian. And you would be reading Pushkin instead of, let's say, Taras Shevchenko, which is a Ukrainian national poet. So that's the story of Russification. The 20th century brings more of influx of the ethnic Russians, but also the rise and prominence of the Russian language. Ukraine turned out to be one of the first places where the industrialization in the Russian Empire starts in the late 19th century. So this is the story of Donbass, of eastern Ukraine, of mining and industrial area. And it's also on the border with Russia.
Can you talk to me about how the 2014 invasion, the significance of that historically, and I'll tell you my end. I think, the Russians never gave up Ukraine, and it's something that most people don't understand. And so when Putin talks about all this stuff about NATO and not another inch more and all this other stuff, I think it really underappreciates the fact that even after the USSR fell, there were people in the Russian, there are officials in the Russian Duma that were really trying to figure out ways to destabilize Ukrainian independence and pull it into his reign. And one of the earlier Moscow mayors, I forgot the man's name, but he was making constant trips to Simferopol, right?
Well, yes, Yuri Lushkov, the mayor of Moscow, traveling to Sevastopol, yes.
Yep, exactly. So you know what I'm talking about. And so these efforts never stopped. But I felt like it was a watershed moment in 2014 because Viktor Yanukovych, he refused to sign several agreements with the European Union. But then that summer, there were also protests, concerning police abuse and brutality. So it was a lead up to that point. But how significant was that first invasion that leads up to 2002 important from a historical standpoint?
It is very important because that's where the war starts in 2014. That's where the first annexation of territory in European history since 1945 occurs. And the idea back then was that Ukraine was preparing to sign trade agreement with European Union, which was called Association Agreement, and Russia tried to stop it from doing that. And the reason that Russia was trying to stop Ukraine from signing an association agreement with European Union was not NATO. Ukraine was under pressure from Russia already, given not in your lifetime answer to the question whether we can join NATO. That happened in 2008. Ukraine was not on the road to joining European Union. European Union was indicating very clearly that they were not interested. So that was, excuse my language, a lousy trade agreement. Why did it become such an important cause and trigger at the same time for annexation, for the start of the war? The reason was simple. Once any country signs trade agreement, association agreement with European Union, it can't become part of any other trade union, which means Ukraine signing association agreement with European Union would not be able to be part of the Eurasian Union that Vladimir Putin was putting together. And that meant, in the plain language, that Ukraine was living the Russian sphere of influence. The space that was formed by the Tsars, by the Russian Empire, maintained by the Bolsheviks and by the commissars and a different name and different structure, Ukraine was about to live. So it's, again, one way to think about that is imagine relationship with abusing husband in the family. And Ukrainians were using in the 1990s this term civilized divorce. And someone is filing for divorce. And what you get is you get the war. So I published last year a book that is called The Russo-Ukrainian War, and I cover both 2014 and 2022 there. But for me, I was struggling for a long period of time whether I should talk about two different wars, one 2014, 2016, the first Russo-Ukrainian war, and then the second starting in 2022. I decided eventually to talk about them as one single process because they're so much interconnected. So this war, it entered this horrible stage in 2022, but it started really in 2014. The goal was to keep Ukraine from living Russian sphere of influence. And once by 2022, the realization came that no matter who is the president of Ukraine, what matters are Ukrainian people, and Ukrainian people don't want to be part of the Russian sphere of influence. That's where the quote-unquote special military operation started. That's the name that Putin gave to the war, and that the Russian propaganda still using, the war of 2022.
So I want to close out with how this second invasion in particular has changed Ukrainian society. I can tell you, just as somebody who lives there, that even after 2014, I feel like it was a different place. And it feels like a different world to me. And I don't know what your thoughts are about this because this is your native land. You can tell me if I'm wrong about it, but it changed for the better in my view. I felt like pre-2014, there was, I guess, what I would call some rust from the Soviet era that was there, that Ukraine was shaking off. But then this war, the first invasion, really made Ukraine realize that we got to really brush the rest of it off ourselves. And then after 2002, it's over. And it's completely, from a cultural and from a vibrancy standpoint, of just walking from city to city, like a very different world. And it feels like a better world. It's a world where I've just seen this Ukrainian renaissance of culture and language. And it's something that's really great to see. And I'm sad that it took two invasions for it to accelerate at this point. But that's what I observe. I know that, like you said, the Ukrainians were not on any tracks to the European Union, to NATO. Now it's inevitable. And I felt like, well, at least Ukrainians tell me, like, they learned that they have more in themselves than they even realized. So I really would like you to kind of talk to us about the cultural changes in Ukraine, what you see and what you foresee.
Yes, we intellectuals, journalists, writers want to believe that really the ideas and what we do, that they change the world. And to a degree this is true, but the global events and existential threats really make some of our ideas count and really discount others. And that's what happened. I'm sorry. That's what happened to Ukraine. The ideas of independence, of importance of language and culture, they were already there. But they were maybe not central for the Ukrainian experience and self-understanding before this really existential threat came in 2014, when Ukrainians suddenly started to realize that they have something to lose. And that something was a thing that is very difficult to describe. It was called freedom. And I'm not trying to use cliches, and because the Ukrainians after 2014, comparing what Russia was bringing to the occupied territories, to the Crimea, they realized that they were free people, and they didn't want to give this up. Because before Russians came up with their alternative and their understanding, it was called Ruskiy Mir, Russian world, Ukrainians didn't really appreciate what they had, or didn't appreciate their potential. And you're absolutely right. Speaking about the rust, for me, that rust was removed with this mass movement that started from below, of removal of monuments to Vladimir Lenin. And it was certainly about communist past and communist abuses, but it was also about the particular form of the government that really had its center in Russia, in Moscow. And that was a ruler of Moscow who conquered Ukraine back in 1919, 1920. So that came to an end, even started the process even before the start of the war. And then I just couldn't believe my eyes going to Ukraine after 2014. I'm a historian, a writer, so I go to the bookstores. I'm old-fashioned guy, so I download certain things, but still I go to the bookstores. And then there was a really, really dramatic change there in terms of the Ukrainian language literature suddenly from being marginal, where the Russian publishers really dominated the Ukrainian book market. Then suddenly that started to change, and that's true for the art. That's true, most importantly, for self-identity and the importance of Ukrainian language. And you said that Ukrainians didn't know probably what they had, and that's my impression as well. For weeks before the start of the all-out invasion in 2022, we lived in this horror of anticipation of what would happen and whether Ukraine would last for 1 week or 2 weeks. And those were the expectations on the outside. Ukraine is fighting back now, already going into the third year. No one could imagine that, including Ukrainians themselves. And just to conclude, sometimes I hear that, well, it's Putin who created Ukraine, speaking about this rise of patriotism, of dignity, of self-identity. I have a very important correction to that statement. It's Ukrainian resistance to Putin that created Ukraine, not Putin.
Yeah. I hear that. And so, how do we better inform ourselves about Ukraine? Those of us who are being introduced to this subject, we're not going to be historians like you. If we really want to seek the truth, what do you suggest?
Well, especially in our today's world, seeking truth is a process, right? So it's a process, because each time you found the truth, or you believe, or good knowledge, or whatever it is, there would be a barrage of disinformation and alternative facts and so on and so forth. So, unfortunately, this is the process that never ends and requires engagement. But there is also one basic idea that I think, when you are interested in Ukraine and what is happening there, or you are interested in South Africa, or you're interested in France, listen to what people in South Africa, in France, in China are telling you, to the same degree that try to listen what people in the United States of America are telling you. That's maybe not the shortest way to the truth, but the one that this is the right path to finding truth, listening to the people and trying to understand them.